Hello and welcome to Conversations with Ex-Catholics. I am Kevin Non-Tradicath, and I am honored to be joined today by Cade of Gay Extrad Speaks. Cade, what is up?
Nothing much. Enjoying the warm weather.
It was like 80 degrees today in Kentucky, so I was quite. I'm sunburned. You probably can't tell; it's mostly already faded, but I'm pretty. Yeah, you're not gonna be able to see it on the camera. That's right. I'm pretty sunburned, and first sunburn of the season is always okay with me.
I was just over the weekend out in Utah doing a big 100-kilometer running race and burned my calves to a crisp and got plenty of sun. It's already a furnace out in Utah, which is always fun to run in, but I'm enjoying the weather.
If I was running 100 kilometers, I think that the sun would be the least of my worries.
That's true. I have to go into the ortho tomorrow because my ankle is still completely swollen and not working at all. So that got real screwed up, but
Jeez. Well, okay.
it's a fun world.
I'm glad that today's stream isn't going to be super strenuous on either of our calves or ankles. so, so, um, we titled the stream something along the lines of "Can teleology prove that homosexuality is wrong?" I think that's what we picked the title. So I think it's safe to assume that today we're going to be talking a little bit about like morality, ethics, and also just kind of gay love, right?
Indeed, indeed.
I know that we have a little bit of an agenda set up. So I was wondering if you had anywhere in particular that you wanted to start.
Awesome. Yeah, I could start a little bit about my story. So I grew up in a not super Catholic household, went occasionally on weekends, standard Novus Ordo parish, just probably the average Catholic experience. And then as I entered into high school, was realizing that I was gay, but was investigating the claims of the church. And like every young Gen Z Catholic decided that the church had great evidence for its claims and read my way into the church. Spent years daily mass, daily adoration, daily full rosary, worked my way into the traditional movement and spent a lot of time going to Latin masses. Went to the FSSP parish here in Denver, and that was quite an experience. And then as I got older, I started investigating the claims of the church again, but with a let's actually investigate the claims and not get basically drawn into these terrible arguments or arguments from emotion or all of what I think the Catholic Church has to offer. I just didn't think that the evidence matched up to the decisions and the lifestyle that the church wanted us to live. Began the deconstruction process, came out publicly. I'm in a great relationship now, and life has never been better, which is crazy to think. A year or 18 months ago, I was going to the Latin Mass every day and praying the full rosary, and now I am a stinky apostate with a boyfriend.
Hey, join the apostate club. So I guess just for the sake of my audience, I have links in the description down below if they want to find out more about you. But the story of kind of your whole religious experience is kind of in the process of being told on your channel, right? And I wouldn't mind you saying the name of your channel right now so that everyone knows where to find you.
Yeah, so linked through Kevin's stream, the channel is just Gay Extrad Speaks, talking through my own journey, doing a number of reaction videos. I'm currently scripting out a very large, probably about 2 hour long lecture on why I don't think that the Catholic Church has sufficient evidence to warrant its approach to same-sex attraction. And there's nothing else out on YouTube like it. So it's a mix of shorter, more rhetorical style reaction videos, and then also some harder hitting deep philosophy, and then working on a few unnamed documentary pieces using my background as a documentary filmmaker that I guarantee you guys are going to want to be subscribed for.
And I do just want to point out that I am already subscribed. So everybody in my audience, I've beat you to the punch. But if you're not already subscribed to Gay Extrad Speaks, the links are in the description down below. Go subscribe now because there is going to be some awesome content over there. And there already is some awesome content over there. One of those awesome pieces of content was a response to Father Mike Schmidt, right? I'm interested to hear a little bit, if you don't mind us kind of starting here. I wouldn't mind hearing a
Yeah.
little bit about, well, I guess, where did you find that video? I had never seen that one before, and I've seen a decent amount of Father Mike Schmidt stuff. And then also, Father Mike Schmidt has this kind of like online persona of being like I guess like the nice kind of guy, like the reasonable kind of guy. And in that video, he seems more run of the mill Catholic. So do you think that do you agree that he has that reputation, and does he deserve that reputation, or does he fall prey to all the same kind of Catholic stuff that, well, the rest of the Catholics fall prey to?
Yeah, so for context, I grew up in the Archdiocese of St. Paul in Minneapolis, and Father Mike's in northern Minnesota. He's technically a different diocese, but the Catholic community in Minnesota is pretty tightly close-knit, unlike some other Catholic communities out there. And so growing up, Father Mike Schmitz, everybody talks about him. He is the celebrity priest in Minnesota, and I met him in person for a few different events. He would come to do masses, he would come to give talks, and so he's a super nice guy. He's a super genuine guy. Everybody around me really looked up to him. So I think that the bias is that I think myself and everybody that I grew up with has watched basically all of his content and knows all of the talks. And he's also presented, especially for those who experience same-sex attraction in the church. I can almost guarantee anybody who experiences same-sex attraction has seen this talk. It's got about 1 million views. For the wider Catholic population, they probably haven't seen it, but Father Mike is looked to as the nice approach to homosexuality and how to make those arguments. And I think he is truly a tremendous speaker. He is incredible at what he does. He's very persuasive. He knows how to go between being super serious and then juxtaposing that with a ton of humor. And you stay on the edge of your seat his entire talk. And one of the kind of critiques of the video that I put out is that I'm editing down his talk a ton, which is absolutely true because his way of speaking is so roundabout. There's so many pauses in there that you get basically stuck in his orbit and his rhetoric, and you forget what the argument is at the end of the day. And I think for most Catholics who have seen his talks, you really forget, like, here's the syllogism, and more like he was really nice about it. I think there's some talk online about like the fundy baby voice where, especially in the Protestant world, there's a lot of people that use that, like, we're just really here to help you, and this like fake empathy. And I think Father Mike Schmitz is like the epitome of the baby fundy voice, but in the Catholic world. So he says these really emotional, charged things where he slows down and gives weight to things. And then as soon as you edit things to like just pull quotes or read a transcript, you're like, this man is just saying average things, but he's a great actor, more or less. Those are my flaming hot takes on Father Mike.
You know what's worse too than that is like it's not only sometimes what they're saying is kind of like a whole lot of nothing, but I find that they seem to be going out of their way to make sure that the point that they're making is confusing. I think sometimes because they know that there's not really a great like argument there. Like whenever I've heard sermons on like why like gay love is disordered, it was never very analytical. It was always just kind of like, hey, look, this is the way that it is, but now let's kind of do some polemics. Now, the polemics that I was used to was probably more similar to fire and brimstone than to what Father Mike Schmidt is doing. And I think that's why Father Mike Schmidt comes off so kind and caring. But I think in essence, it's kind of like, it's the same message, just with like a different coat of paint on it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and as I pointed out in my video, who he's talking to, and I've when I was Catholic, I found it very convincing and shared it to people, and secular people see it and they're like, what is happening? But for Catholics who have been told what the church teaching is and want an answer, this is the best one out there. And so in comparison to like the average Catholic response, which is like, it's wrong because it's just wrong and we should have no compassion about it, like Father Mike Schmitz is a step up. And so he seems really convincing until you look at like the steps anywhere else in the world or how we do any other sort of arguments. You know, like this is entirely worthless. And I also think in his talk, he's, once again, like I said, he's not talking to secular audiences. He's talking to Catholics, especially younger ones. This is at a Steubenville conference. The people who are in attendance here are people who are struggling with same-sex attraction to begin with. And so he's not making a secular argument for his case. He's making a case to a bunch of closeted teens who are scared to come out, and finally addresses those concerns of like, you feel like people are going to hate you if you come out. You feel like the church is going to make you always feel alone. So I think the weight of his talk is that a lot of those youth feel seen for the first time. Their feelings are like, oh, that is what I'm feeling. And so they look at him as like, oh, he gets me, like he has a great answer. But as I was talking to a friend who's a recent convert and runs like an anti-porn ministry, I was talking to him and he's like, when I was becoming Catholic, my parish priest always had answers to the questions I asked. And I was like, of course, there's always going to be answers. The question is, are they good answers? And do they stack up against other answers? And do they hold the burden of proof to warrant a certain decision? And so I think Father Mike Schmitz provides the best answers on this topic. But if you really deconstruct and just read what he's arguing, you realize it's entirely vacuous, just with a little nice spin on it.
Yeah. And I find that the vacuous nature of the answers is perhaps the most frustrating thing to me. I don't mean to like derail us entirely, but I have spoken to like Catholics in my life, like in real life, believe it or not, I still talk to Catholics without it being on camera. And sometimes I'll say something to the effect of like they'll say like, oh, like what's your biggest problem with the church? I'll say like, you know, I guess it's hard to kind of narrow it down, but if I'm going to pick one, I do think that the church's like sexual ethic is just entirely misguided. I think the whole thing is pretty wrong. And the normal gut reaction from the Catholic here is, oh, well, you know, let's not start with sexual ethics. First, I'm going to prove to you that the church has the authority to call these shots, and then you're just going to accept that the church has the authority to call these shots, so you're going to accept this answer, even if it is vacuous. Now, they don't say even if it is vacuous, but the fact that they're almost never willing to actually engage with this subject in particular, to me, betrays the fact that they know that their only talking point here is a vacuous talking point. And I find that like particularly frustrating. And I don't know if you've experienced the same thing when you talk to the Catholics in your life, but that's been my experience.
Yeah. There's kind of two things, and I think you have it right. One is like, every time I talk to traditional Catholics, especially since leaving, and that caused a whole lot of hubbub at the traditional Catholic college I used to go to. It was a huge thing. There's people that are reaching out, and I basically told them point blank, and we'll be moving here into my arguments of why I think teleology fails to prove that homosexuality is wrong. Nobody wanted to engage on this subject. And I was like, here's my argument, which is basically we want evidence in proportion to the weight of our decisions to be mandated to or for celibacy for the rest of your life is a massive decision, even within a Catholic framework. And so our evidence should match that proportionally. And nobody was willing to engage in a conversation. These are people who pride themselves on apologetics. And I was talking to a friend, and we're close friends. He's a traditional Catholic. And at the end of our discussion, he sidestepped and said, more or less, I disagree with your lifestyle, not because I have anything personal against you, but because I have to be faithful to the church. And that's why, to your earlier streams talking about like the Catholic Church being anti-intellectual, is none of these people, I really don't think they would arrive to those conclusions if the church allowed you to have different positions. But so many Catholics go, well, I have to hold this position, so I got to grasp onto straws and call that my proof. And I find that incredibly disingenuous, and most Catholics want to sidestep it. And then you have this like in-group versus out-group speak, which is in public settings, in secular engagements. Catholics are going to sidestep this issue. They're going to talk about how nice the church is, and you see it in people like Bishop Barrett talking to Dave Rubin, like, we're more or less not going to talk about it to begin with because it's not a big thing. You're like, this is a huge thing. Like, why would you not want to talk about it? And then inside of Catholic circles, once we get beyond the telling secular people the church doesn't hate you, the church is nice, and then inside of the church, then we can talk about the crazy groomers out there in the culture, and gay marriage is ruining civilization, and all of these are just like wild claims. But because they know they're not going to get pushback. It's the same thing in traditional parishes when they have like the Kolbe Center talking about anti-evolution. They love having these study groups because they can all have this like intellectual circle jerk around how much they hate evolution. And then when you get into the secular culture, like, well, it's not a big thing. And you're like, well, you make it a big thing because all you do is talk about evolution and Darwinism for every single point in all of history is Darwin ruined all of it. And you're like, if you're going to talk that much about it, you should probably have proportional proof. And that's why I find the whole endeavor largely disingenuous and completely vacuous and anti-intellectual.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I find that to be the case not only for evolution and Darwinism, not only for no Catholic would say that like sexual ethics isn't a big deal. They would say it's a big deal. They just won't engage. But Marian apparitions, this is like a new thing for me where like I've really tried to push back on Marian apparitions. And it's so funny how all Catholics' instant response is like, well, they're not mandatory. They're not mandatory. But nobody doesn't believe them. And it's like, come on now. Like, which one is it? Is it not very important? And so, take it or leave it? Or is it so important that there are prayers from Fatima that have been ingrained into the Mass? Which is the case. Like, which one is it, people?
And for your
like
church to be named after an apparition is like, clearly this isn't like somebody randomly in a village somewhere was like, this is a cool thing. It's like you named a goddamn church after this. Like clearly this isn't just like lore out there or so like some like fanfic from a random nun. Like this is important. You named a church after it, and all you're gonna do is talk about the third secret of Fatima and how souls go to hell like snowflakes. Like this is a huge deal. And then you play this intellectual whack-a-mole with Catholics where they're like, as soon as you beat them on one topic, then it's just like, well, that is actually not important. And then you start beating them over here, and then you just keep playing whack-a-mole until you realize that people aren't doing it for these illogical reasons. They're doing it because of these emotional things. They're afraid of leaving. If they ever entertain the idea of leaving, they're going right to hell. And so you can't even have these honest discussions, because if you have those honest discussions, that's a sin that you got to go tell Father about, and he's going to tell you you're going to go to hell and tell you to pray your Hail Marys. And that's when Catholics love talking about scholasticism and the intellectual tradition. You're like, this isn't an intellectual tradition. This is cult thinking at its finest, and trying to call this thinking. You're not doing thinking, because if you were thinking, you'd go right to hell. Is why all of this is just dumb.
I have found a few Catholics who have pretty much said to me, like, hey, look, I'm convinced that no beliefs are actually founded upon like rational thinking. Rather, the belief formation comes first, and then the reasons for belief are actually secondary to the belief itself. And so I can't help that I am Catholic, that I believe in the truth of the Catholic Church. I just believe it, and I'm going to come up with reasons why it's true, just like somebody who is an atheist is going to, same thing for them. The belief comes first and the reasons come after. Why? That's just how human cognition works. And I find that to be so refreshing and honest, but also few and far between. And almost none of the like really hardcore trads are going to ever admit something like that.
The only way an apologist can actually beat somebody in a discussion, let's say about homosexuality, is they play this game where like you can't objectively prove anything as an atheist, or like you can only prove things when we have God, and you just dig to this philosophical bedrock with just stupid questions. Like I was talking to a friend for I kid not, I think like 4 or 5 hours, and we got to the like, why don't we kill people discussion, which is like, once we have the why don't we kill people discussions, like we're so far from touching grass, like what world do we live in? And then I was like, people don't want to live in a world where we're all going to get killed. And he's like, well, why should we do what people want? And you're like, what sort of question is that? Like nobody wants to die or be randomly murdered in their home, except for maybe some like crazy people on Reddit. But like, I don't know, we do things because we want to do things. And then it's like, well, how come you can't objectively prove that? I can objectively state that. And you're like, you're just asserting this thing and calling it bedrock in the same way that everybody's just asserting different things. Is this huge anti-intellectual thing that the only playbook that apologists have is play this game of like, you can't know anything as an atheist, and then just assert things to backfill this hole that they've dug themselves into. Is every dialogue that I've seen from modern Catholic apologists. But I think that'll probably dovetail us right into if we want to dive deep, or actually dive into the arguments that I kind of laid out of teleology and homosexuality.
Let's do it.
Awesome. So I'll run through a few bullet points here. One is that the burden of proof is on people that want to claim homosexuality is wrong. Two is that the decision to be celibate, or in this case, prescribing mandatory celibacy, is a massive decision, and we have no way, and we have no sufficient proof to match that level of a decision. We throw things out there like hypothesis theories, like teleology, which isn't a coherent concept to begin with. And so until somebody can actually present a shred of evidence beyond word games, I'm just not going to engage with your arguments, because then we play word games and go in circles for all of eternity. In the analogy that I like to make when it comes to burden of proof is vegans. And I think most Catholics will actually despise vegans. And I'm a big fan of chicken and pork. So I think I like to use vegans because Catholics can like, oh, it's those vegans are so cringe, you know. You get people onto the kind of the same side of things. So when you talk about vegans, there's like different levels of claims. Meaning if somebody says, I'm vegan, you're like, cool, you're vegan. You're not telling anybody else to be vegan. You don't need proof. Like if you want to be vegan or you want to do anything, like if you want to do it, as long as it's not hurting other people, as long as it's legal, like you should have the right to do it. Versus like one step from that is, I'm vegan because insert a personal testimony. And so you should consider veganism. Just like a step further when it comes to making a claim, because you're sharing an experience and inviting other people to have that experience, or for people that might have that experience. And then we like take it a step further and say, I'm vegan and you should consider veganism. And if somebody walked up to you and said that, you're like, I'm probably going to want to hear a reason, and not some sort of slogan like animals are friends, not food. It's like that like might be there. And then we take it a step further and say like, I'm vegan and you have to be vegan. It's like if somebody walks up to me or anybody out there and said, it's like, I'm going to want to see proof, and probably overwhelming proof. And then the downsides don't outweigh the benefits of doing it. And then we take a step further and say, I'm vegan and the meat industry shouldn't be legal now. Is like, holy crap, like we should probably have some really solid evidence and really weigh the effects of actually making it illegal. And then if a vegan comes out of the woodwork and says, I'm vegan and for all of eternity in any context, even the slightest hint of eating meat can never be accepted and we need to legislate against it. If somebody came up to your average like Jim Bro, your average conservative guy who loves talking about Catholicism, you're going to be basically laugh, and until they provide irrefutable, undeniable, multiple disciplinary evidence and prove there's no downsides to it. Like, and that's what I think that we miss when it comes to homosexuality is like, sure, we can throw teleology out there, but it's not that, oh, like there might be downsides to living quote unquote the gay lifestyle. It's that like you can never do this in any context and any time, and we need to legislate against it, and this should affect how we do laws. There's all of these things when you're like, this is a massive claim to make. And when we talk about the church's teaching on same-sex attraction, it's a huge decision that even Catholics give a lot of weight to and talk about the emotional side. It's lifelong mandatory celibacy. It's not like wait until you're older, like a more like politically conservative approach might be. It's not like, well, as long as you get married and are monogamous, it's going to be okay. It's a lifelong mandatory celibacy that it's considered a disorder. As we talk about, that language is a little bit different than a mental disorder, but you're going to be looked at by suspicion by many people in the church. And as nice as Catholics are about it, you're still not going to be just the average person in the parish. You can't ever be in the near occasion of sin, which is why people and a lot of Catholics even discourage groups like Courage, where men who experience same-sex attraction but are celibate shouldn't get together. And if they have any feelings, they can't even be friends because we're in the near occasion of sin. You can't engage in the slightest gay activity. So dating, wearing a pride pin, anything, not even like you can't do anything. And this can never change. And in no point in the future, thousands of years from now, or any time in the past, has this ever been acceptable. The church has no solution or no proof to show that this is a sustainable lifestyle. And if you do anything, including openly discussing disobeying or thinking about disobeying, you're going to be sent to hell for all of eternity. Is like, that's the one thing that I like to drive home before we dive into these topics, is like, this is a huge decision. even if you think you have proof, if you don't think this is a huge decision, I don't even like you're not being intellectually honest, or you have no empathy to begin with.
Yeah, just some kind of brief thoughts that I want to add at this point is that one of the first things that happened to me, so when I was still, like, I still considered myself Catholic. This was probably 6 or 7 years ago at this point. But I also realized that I was like, well, okay, I'm really struggling with the church's teaching on like gay marriage. One of the first things that occurred to me was, if I'm like really struggling on this, then it appears to me like I should probably proportion the amount of time and effort that I allot to opposing it to the certainty with which I know that it is wrong. That is to say, I should probably spend absolutely no time trying to oppose gay marriage, because I myself am not at all certain that it is wrong, even though the church tells me that it is. And that just kind of seems like self-evident to me, that like we should probably proportion our evidence to the belief, and we should probably proportion our effort to our belief as well. And it occurred to me, and like the veganism example is a really good one, because it occurred to me, I remember being probably like 21 or 22, and it occurred to me that I find factory farming to be abhorrent. Like it's disgusting. When you actually learn about the practices at factory farming, it's awful. Like it makes you want to be vegan. Spoiler, I am not vegan. And for a long time, I didn't even try that hard to not eat factory farmed meat. One thing that I do now is that I do buy my cow from a local farm. So like I know how that cow is living for the vast majority of its life. And yay, I'm privileged in as much as I get to do that. I live close to a farm and I can afford to buy half a cow at a time. It's not cheap. Not everyone can do that. And so I try not to talk about this too much or anything. But like, that's about the extent of what I do, even though I'm pretty emotionally moved by the evils of factory farming. Like, I think that that's like a disgusting practice that I hope to see eradicated. And I don't do that much about it, all things considered. And so it blows my mind that Catholics will do so much to try to make gay marriage illegal and stuff like that, when they don't even appear to have the fantastic reasons for thinking why it's wrong in the first place. And I just find that to be incredibly disappointing and frustrating, and I guess a lot of words. But sorry, I didn't mean to like totally derail you. I just kind of wanted to throw that in there because I really like the analogy.
Yeah, and I think that's a point with veganism. Like, we see factory farming isn't a great thing, but the solution isn't like we need to abolish the entire meat industry. It's not that we need to legislate all of this. It's not, because when we think about like, so if we just say it's objectively wrong, like what happens next? It's like so much of the economy is propped up on it. So even if we do want to say that it's wrong, we should probably approach what are the consequences of legislating this way, an immediate way. And then we talk about like, could it ever be done properly? Which is like, assuming that, and I think everybody agrees that like killing animals in principle isn't wrong. Like, well, we could have factory farming, but in a much more nice way. We could look to reform it. But for somebody to just like throw everything out there as intrinsically evil, not only is it evil now, and you could make the argument of like, well, we have other types of food out there that we can get nutrition for, so we don't need factory farming as much. But if we go back, like cavemen starving in the wilderness, they see a woolly mammoth, even then they can't do it. They can't kill an animal. You'd be like, so for all of eternity, this is wrong. And that's where I think we, in a lot of Catholics, get lost in just basically this philosophical land. And there's a point where we just got to have like a come to Jesus moment and in a secular context, or a let's touch grass moment, where you're like, if the only way to know that something's wrong isn't by intuition, it's not by observation, there's no consequences to it other than you spend decades of researching this thing in a library somewhere. If that's the only way to determine morality, God must be pretty incompetent at morality, let alone to send people to hell for all of eternity because they didn't spend and get their degree in teleology, because it's not actually intuitive. It's like you talk to the average person and you can have a conversation, and you talk to Catholics, and we just get stuck into like, well, how do we know that anything's wrong, and how do we know anything? You're like, just touch grass, like meet somebody who's living an awesome life, who might not pray the rosary 8 times a day. Like, talk to people, you're going to find out that they have normal lives. And when we talk about the pro-gay position, it's backed up by science, it's backed up by law, it's backed up by modern people's sensibilities, and it has a proven solution and a proven pathway for people to have normal lives. And then we look at the anti-gay position, it's backed up by word games, hack science, and like the same arguments of like, well, how do we know that anything's wrong? And there's not a single study proving that the anti-gay lifestyle is actually good for people. Like, we look at these two different weights, these two different reasons to believe different things, and you're like, if we touch grass and we just have a normal conversation with the average person, like, I don't know how we reach being gay is wrong apart from like, let's spend 12 hours discussing ancient philosophy and playing word games. It's just like so far out there that it's such I think a dumb conversation to begin with, to start. So that's like all to just start when it comes to like the burden of proof. I think Catholics walk into this as if like this doesn't matter and we don't really need any proof. It's just whatever the church teaches. It's the same way if a vegan walks up to me and says their interpretation of Christianity means that it's objectively wrong to eat meat. I go, I don't subscribe to your framework to begin with. So you either have to prove to me your entire framework, or you have to use some other framework to prove that eating meat is wrong. And that's kind of leads into the second point on hypotheses. And this is from Hank Green talks about these. And I think it's a great point when we enter these discussions. Like, a hypothesis is a question that you can wonder, and then you can go out there and test it, and you can validate or invalidate it. Versus a hypothesis is just like an assertion that you're like, this just like sounds good. And the problem here is that then I can just assert the exact opposite thing. Meaning, if somebody says like gay marriage undermines the institution of marriage, I can say straight marriage undermines the institution of marriage, or denying gay couples the right to get married undermines the institution of marriage. Like, I think an important question to ask when we make these claims is, how could we ever investigate that claim? And gay marriage undermining the institution of marriage is an assertion, and we can't ever validate or invalidate it. So it's just meaningless words going out there. Same thing with like gay marriage is unnatural. I can say straight marriage is unnatural. Like, there's a point where it's like, as people are in the gay community, you're like, you almost like forget that straight people exist in the same way that like straight people forget that gay people exist. And so I can say straight marriage is unnatural in the same way you can say gay marriage is unnatural, or marriage can't be modified. It can only be a man and a woman. I can say marriage has to be modified every single year by a high court, and that's the only thing that's marriage. Like, the important question to ask here is like, can we ever investigate your BS claims about random things that don't track to any reality? And until we can actually investigate your claims, I'm not going to engage in your word games and get caught up in semantics and polemics and all of these things. It's like, let's have a grounded conversation in reality and not some library looking at massive textbooks.
Yeah. Something that you said that kind of prompted some thoughts in my brain was the point where, so you were talking about how people will make these claims that frankly, they're not empirical claims at all. Like, legalizing gay marriage will undermine the institution of marriage, something like that. And then if you push and if you prod, there is kind of no way for you to investigate. That reminds me, I've had several conversations that will start with something like this. Somebody will say something like, well, gay marriage is wrong because it's unnatural. And I'll say something to them like, what do you mean by unnatural? And they'll say something to the effect of like, well, like it's just like nature is such that like that's not how you make babies, so therefore it's unnatural. And I said, if I could demonstrate to you that it was if this is something that occurs in nature, like if we could observe animals doing this, would that convince you that it is therefore natural? And they're like, well, maybe not. And I'm like, okay, so when you say that it's not natural, we need to be careful with our terms here, because I think that you don't mean unnatural as in like it doesn't occur in nature. I think that you mean unnatural like you just don't like it. Like and that's how it seems to go for a lot of these going back to the Catholic who told me belief comes first, reasons come after, I think that's true for a lot of this stuff. I think that a lot of people just kind of think like, oh, I'm grossed out by gay people because I'm a bigot, and now I'm going to try to come up with reasons as to why I'm grossed out, instead of actually sitting there and being like, is my preconceived notions about gay people, like, do I have valid reasons for thinking this? No. Rather, it's just, let me try to back up the bigotry that I was probably born with. And I've said that I said that for the first time. I'll say it again here. It is disappointing. It is frustrating. And it's perhaps my biggest like gripe with the church and with modern Catholicism. So I want to pull up a comment real quick. My friend Daniel says the church is definitely moving towards greater acceptance, granted more slowly than the broader culture and with qualifications. Daniel says that he thinks that the church is taking a careful approach. What I want to add here is, so yes, I do think that the church is very slowly moving towards acceptance of gay marriage. However, when this isn't just a matter of like people being inconvenienced, right? Like there are people who are killed for their sexuality. And I think that if the church has the power to drive broader acceptance of like queer people and doesn't do that because they're trying to be careful, then I think that the church is not being careful at all, but rather I think that the church is actually doing something that's very dangerous and it's harmful. And I think that the church would be doing a much more careful thing if it tried to rush a little bit more quickly rather than this kind of slow, meandering walk towards acceptance. That's all I want to say there. Sorry for interrupting.
No. And I think to that point, I mean, the Catholic Church loves talking about how we have the fullness of the truth and we know what's right and what's wrong. And then you realize that it's largely charted to the culture moving around. Even when we talk about topics like slavery or racism or sexism or all these claims, Catholics love saying things that are popular in the culture. But 200 years ago, there wasn't the Friar Mike talking about how people that are attracted to members of the same sex should be treated with compassion. Any sign of unjust discrimination should be stamped out. Like that wasn't something that was happening 200 years ago. We can talk about Mother Teresa has some interviews where she talks about children of God. But when we talk about like, what does the average Catholic in 1960 think about gay people? It's like so absolutely different than what the Catholic Church is trying to backpedal and see more culturally appropriate. You have the same things, especially with like the LDS Church, where they're like, we have a prophet that can talk directly to God. And then it's like, well, and then we change when it comes to the priesthood standard and people, non-white people can actually get the priesthood. And you're like, well, if you had a prophet, he probably should have told you that like way sooner when it was not popular. And same thing with Catholics, where it's like, well, the church is just wants to be cautious. It's just trying to like catch up. It's going to be more inclusive. And I think there's two responses there. Is like, one, sure, like the social attitudes are getting padded and are being nicer, but at the end of the day, it's still the same church teaching. Like everybody talks about Pope Francis is more accepting. He talks about like, who am I to judge? And then you ask the question, like, can somebody engage, or can somebody be in a same-sex relationship and be a full member of their local church community and go to heaven, not in a, like a despite their sexuality, but that the love between them and their same-sex partner is a good thing? The answer is still no. It's like we can play these nice things, but it's like at the end of the day, the answer is still no. And that's why in my reaction video, I was talking about like, we're just patting the same hammer that's going to knock you out, and we're wrapping a pile of crap with a bow and calling it a present and asking why people aren't happy to accept it. And then to your point, like this isn't a thing that like, oh, we're just talking about like some legal concept when it comes to like inheritance law. It's like this is something that's affecting people right now and has been affecting people for all of history. And so for the Catholic Church to like in 100 years from now go like, oh, actually like gay people can get married. You're like, we've had thousands of years of you guys telling people that they have to live lives of celibacy, that they can't ever fall in love with somebody to whom they're attracted. They can't ever build a life with somebody to whom they're attracted. They can't ever have a family. They can't be a full participating member of society. For hundreds of years, that's millions and millions of people's lives ruined because you want to play this cautious card out there. when you're like, the real thing here is like all of the science proves that living a gay lifestyle is much better for you in any metric out there and is still going to lead to a happy, fulfilled, normal life. And we have no evidence to prove the contrary. So, and that's why I talk about the burden of proof of like, this is something that is destroying people's lives right now. And for people to play this game of like, well, the church wants to be nice about it and we're progressing, it's like, hurry up because you're destroying people's lives right now. This is an anti-intellectual exercise. Yeah, those are my flaming hot takes. Do you want to go through any questions or comments before we dive into actually talking about teleology?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. My friend Daniel just and this is a fair point, and here's what I'll have to say about that. So Daniel says, what did the average person in the 1960s say about gay people? Daniel says he grew up in the 70s. It wasn't pretty. I mean, I was born in 95. I said, really, I mean, I used gay like a slur, like it was my job to use the word gay like it was a slur, through until what? When did it become like actually taboo? I was never a brave person.
Like late 2000s, early 10s.
Yeah, like up until I was in like high school. I think I started high school in 2010. So, up until about 2010, probably I was like, and why did I do that? Because I didn't know any better, I guess. I mean, let me not try to make excuses, but
Yeah.
I did it because...
Well, I think to John's point there, when we talk about like what does the average person think in 1960s, if we talk about a secular framework, like people are going to have their opinions, and secularism isn't this like God told us the absolute truths of morality. Like the thing that the church should have been doing in the 60s is having something radically different. If it's this infallible, having all of the right teachings, having inspired scripture by God, being able to make infallible statements, like our claim isn't that people magically know everything perfectly and morality never changes, and this is like everything people should believe. It's that here's a framework to ask moral questions about, versus the church's claim is like, we are right and we have the truth. We sure would have wanted to see that at times when it wasn't actually popular. Yeah, so it's like it's just a categorical difference where we're not claiming the same things that the church claims. So like, what does the average person think? It's like, well, what would the average Catholic think? And then we play this game of like whack-a-mole and anti-intellectual whack-a-mole, where it's like, well, if somebody were a real Catholic in 1960, they would have believed these things. And you're like, so were real Catholics like only the liberal ones that you hate? Like, are the only real Catholics the Jesuits in the early times, and then now it's the traditional ones? It's like we can play this like no true Scotsman's fallacy for all of eternity. And these are where we have unfalsifiable standards where it's like, well, if the church says something ahead of its time, it was right. And then if the church doesn't say things ahead of its time, it's because people weren't Catholic enough. So no matter what you say, it's like the church is going to be right no matter what, is why these arguments fail. I'm seeing some other nice juicy comments in the comment section.
If you have particular ones that you want me to pull up, I definitely will. And what I'll say is yes, you hit the nail on the head. The church changing with the times makes a lot of sense from a perspective of the church is comprised of people and just doing people things. But if you do think that the church is being like led by the Holy Ghost or something like that, it does seem a little weird that we see the church changing with the times.
Let me see. I'm seeing earlier here, like Lost But Found says, well, even basic truths of morality are obscured due to the effects of the fall. Even things we can know by reason alone, we still practically require the supernatural gifts to know. And that's a perfect example of a hypothesis. Like, that's just an assertion. Like, there is nothing to back that up other than a set of a literary device. It's like, so how could we investigate that claim? We can't investigate that claim because it's unfalsifiable. Because if we do prove something, it's like, well, because natural reason. If we don't prove something that you agree with, it's because of the fall. So no matter what happens, you have an unfalsifiable statement that can't be verified. That's a prime example of like, okay, like, what am I going to do with that argument other than ignore it because it's not actually arguing anything. It's just an assertion.
Yeah, and this is perhaps what I find like the most frustrating part about talking with people of this persuasion. It's that they only use empiricism insofar as empiricism already backs up the points that they've already arrived at without using empiricism to get there. And then when all of a sudden the empirical method doesn't lead them in a direction that they want to go, well, the use of reason was, affected by the fall. Hey, we all have concupiscence, and therefore we need the supernatural gift of the church. And it's like, well, hold on, pick one and stick with it, please. Be honest and tell me that you're a presup, or join me and the entire scientific tradition on the side of empiricism. But this kind of fence sitting is just kind of dishonest. It's just dishonest. Yeah, I was following that whole conversation in the sidebar. And there's a couple guys in here who, I'd love to have on the show and ask them about.
I mean, Joe O'Leary is popping off here with just these out of pocket statements. That like, eating meat is the natural diet of man and veganism is a fad. It's like, once again, eating meat is the natural diet of man isn't actually, when you look at the science, like there's conflicting science on what did early people actually eat. The church is the greatest employer of gay men in history, which is actually true. Joe's being very based here. Fully agree. It's actually like funny that all these church teachings are propagated by a bunch of self-hating gays. Joe's calling being gay unnatural because it produces no children, which is like, once again, we're throwing these things out there. It's unnatural, which means it can't produce children. And then we play the game of like, so is anything that can't produce children unnatural? And the answer is like, no. So like now we're in this special category of like gay unnaturalism, I think should be like the new philosophy, where it's like any other version of unnatural isn't true, but gay specifically stuff. And then that like, see, the argument is we can't know truth. And the problem, Joe, is that we can know truth and we can agree on truth and we can investigate truth. And we have a mechanism by which we can investigate claims, and not taking a bunch of people in fancy robes in the Vatican basically doing dress up all day as like our way of knowing knowledge. It's like anybody can do science anywhere. But apparently the only way to know for a book to tell you that is such a weird thing. We'll get to some of these other comments. I'm thinking we dive into teleology here.
Let's do it. I just want to add one more point here, is that the way that Joe wrote this is even just that it's unnatural in that no children are produced. It's not even, and I doubt that he meant are. He probably meant could be produced. But the way that he phrased it here would mean that the vast majority of all sex ever, straight or otherwise, would be unnatural. And if that's your argument, that just, hey, 99% of all sex ever, any times that sex didn't result in an egg being fertilized, that is unnatural. Okay, now unnatural just actually refers to the vast majority of all sex that has ever been had ever. And I think that we've watered down the meaning of the word unnatural. But again, I doubt that he meant are produced, and he probably meant could be produced. So anyway, let's do teleology.
Awesome. So teleology is more or less, there's kind of like two routes when it comes to anti-gay talking points. One is like hack science, as I call it. The reason why I call it hack science is because when we survey actual scientific studies, we might have a handful of studies that have, let's say, anti-gay conclusions, and they always have terrible methodology. And even if they did have right methodology, we're talking about one compared to hundreds of other pro-gay studies. So we're not even using the right scales here. So teleology tends to undergird most anti-gay points. So when we talk about teleology is like, how do we do teleology? And the answer is like, nobody knows and nobody can agree, meaning that teleology is this vague term used by some ancient philosophers, so we can call it like a philosophy. But it's really only unique to Catholics, especially those with a more traditional bent. Not even all Protestants agree on Catholic conclusions when it comes to teleology. Even Catholics can't agree on what teleology means. So we have this like giant word salad that nobody knows how to do. We can't prove that teleology exists apart from semantics. We can't prove that what teleology tells us. We can't prove what breaks teleology. We can't demonstrate the effects of breaking teleology. We can't weigh teleology in a pro versus con value judgment style. When it comes to legislation, we don't accept teleology in how we do law, and we don't have any proof that we should include it in how we do legislation. So we don't have any coherent way of arriving at truth, let alone one that anybody can agree upon. And it's just full of all of these contradictions. And so we talk about like, is God's truth only apparent to less than a fraction of a percent of people on all of planet Earth? Sure seems like a really confusing way that God just wants to send people to hell if only a fraction of a few percent of people actually agree upon it. Doesn't seem like a super great way of arriving at truth, I would argue.
Yeah. I was just rereading a book called The Unnatural Science, which is just like a really good response to pretty much Ed Fazer's entire corpus of books. Um, and the section that was just kind of brushing up on in preparation for today's call made a really good point about how so Fazer and the rest of the kind of like people who really come from the Thomistic tradition will talk about the word good as in like adhering to the essence of the thing. So like a good triangle is one that has exactly straight sides, right? If the side is curved at all, that it's not as good as it otherwise could be. But the author of The Unnecessary Science, his whole point was like, nobody uses the word good like that. Nobody actually, when they say good, they don't mean it adheres to this abstract object, this essence of trianglehood in my brain. No, it just generally means something like pleasing or useful even. So like people don't have these really obscure philosophical definitions in mind when they use words like good, despite what people like Ed Fazer might tell you ordinary people have in mind. So I just kind of thought that was a good point. Wanted to highlight that.
Yeah. And when it comes to teleology, I was like playing games, or it seems like teleology really only comes to an effect when it comes to homosexuality, is really the only time that it's brought up in this like categorical, definitive, prescriptive way. So when we talk about like teleology, like how do we apply that to other questions in life? Meaning like, can we consume diet soda? Like the entire point of diet soda is to work against consuming calories in soda. And then you're like, well, there's caffeine in it, so there actually is a purpose. And you're like, that's the exact same argument when it comes to sexuality. Like it's for babies and bonding, but like we remove the babies part and we still have the bonding part in the same way that when we talk about like what is soda for, it's like, can we consume diet soda? And then it's like, can we walk on our hands? Like that's not what our hands were quote unquote designed for. Can we have certain cosmetic procedures? I was like bringing up the case, and Catholics don't ever have a coherent way of evaluating these claims. But for a lot of pro runners, run into a lot of issues with their toenails, especially in like the ultra distance world, where like this year I'll have a 200-mile race and my toenails will be destroyed. And for some pro runners, they make the decision to remove their toenails permanently. And it's like we are explicitly working against toenails and the building of toenails in the foot naturally. Like we are directly working against it. So is that wrong when it comes to teleology? Like there's no intelligible way to deploy teleology as a method of arriving to truth. And sure, people can throw their approach when it comes to some of these questions out there, but nobody's going to agree on anything except for when it comes to homosexuality. So when we talk about like arguments against homosexuality, it comes down to like sex is for babies and bonding. And Catholics love talking about like, well, if aliens came down to Earth, like they would see that it's for babies and bonding. And this is the huge like categorical failure of teleology, is we make descriptive versus prescriptive claims. Like we can make verifiable descriptive claims of like some forms of sexuality lead to procreation. We can make claims like people that engage in consensual contact report feelings of being closer together. Like we can make descriptive claims about the world. And then when we get this for is like smuggling in or intuition pumping prescriptive things. So when it comes to like, is sex for babies and bonding, is like for is this word that doesn't mean that means something very different, is how these arguments get made. So like and then what does it mean to deliberately work against an end? Like what does that even constitute? When we talk about natural family planning, like the intended end, which is not procreating, the same thing happens. Like, can we say that not entering into the sexual embrace during fertile times is working against the end? And it seems like Catholics do make that argument and bite the bullet, especially in traditional circles. So we don't even know what it means to work against teleology. And so when it comes to like, is gay sex open to life? And I think for a lot of gay couples, it's like, I mean, theoretically, like some couples would love that. So it's not like when gay people go to to have sex. It's like we despise children and have a satanic ritual and go down to the abortion clinic beforehand to make a tithing offering to the devil. It's like that's not what's happening. Like we make all of these arguments that are just these incoherent ramblings, which kind of leads to this conclusion here, which is like the church claims homosexuality is intrinsically evil, which means at no time, in no place, in no context can even the slightest homosexual action be tolerated. When we know from a scientific fact that data shows that there is harm in living in the closet, in this self-hatred, or when we talk about mandatory celibacy, however we want to wrap that bow on a pile of crap. And then we talk about mandating celibacy is a huge claim that is proven to actually disintegrate people. So it's like, even if teleology is correct on this issue, I don't think that it matches up to scientific scrutiny or meets that barrier to what the church's level of certainty is on it. And so, like, until more than a fraction of a percentage of humans on Earth can agree on teleology, we have a single shred of evidence that teleology exists. We have any coherent way of talking about teleology. We can run experiments on teleology. We have a single shred of evidence that there are harms in breaking teleology. I'm not going to entertain these baseless assertions that there is scientific harm to these millions of people. Like, this is a dumb argument that is destroying people's lives, has a huge barrier to entry. And so until people get even remotely close to there, I'm not going to give these arguments like a ton of credibility. And that's kind of like the overarching theme here, is that we got to have two camps. It's like either we stop touching grass and we get stuck into like, well, let's look at Aristotle from 3,000 years ago, and we spent decades studying philosophy, all to come to the conclusion, which is like gay people are nice and have awesome lives, but there's this magical blueprint that they're breaking. It's like, and that's just not apparent to anybody, and it's not a way of arriving at truth, let alone something that's going to allow us to make legislation when all of the science shows, and I get that a lot of people talk about empiricism, is like, well, we can't know anything apart from science. It's like the only things that we do know about homosexuality is that it's not bad, and that to hide in the closet or to deny yourself is a terrible thing. Like, all of science points that way. So it's not that I say everything in life has to come down to a scientific study, but when all of the scientific studies point one direction and the only thing pointing the other direction is word games, like, how do you want the average person to make a conclusion apart from spending decades reading stupid books?
I hope the microphone could pick up the snapping, but yeah, that was awesome. I mean, I think that I don't do a whole lot of grass touching on this channel, and I think that's something that I should work on doing more of. But that whole last section was so important because you're exactly right. The kinds of people who obsess about this stuff, the guys who go read Phaser and Aquinas and Aristotle, and then they'll go read Nagel, the one atheist guy who wrote Mind and Cosmos, and they'll read Oderberg, Real Essentialism, and they never actually go, and they just, like, I don't know, look at a single scientific study, talk to a single gay person. Like, it never happens. And I've said before on this channel, I'll say it again. People get mad at me for saying this, but I think that the types of people who we're describing here, like the scholastic types, taking literally just like physics 101, chemistry 101, and biology 101 would do wonders for these people. And I also think that like making a single gay friend would do like wonders for these people. And I have to imagine that not a lot of these people do have a science education or.
And that's where I think if we want to have a discussion where somebody says, well, because my faith says this, I'm going to follow these rules. You're like I said, that's like the vegan who just says, I'm vegan because I want to. And you're like awesome. Like, and there's a comment on my YouTube channel of like, I'm a Catholic who finds great peace in the church's teaching on same-sex attraction, live a celibate life. You're like, cool. Like, nobody in the gay community has like a mandatory weekend hookup. Like, this isn't something that happens. Like, all we're talking about is the choice that people have. And Catholics love talking about the like, well, the church isn't discriminating against gays. Like, if I as a straight man am attracted to somebody who's not my spouse, I have the same church teaching. And then we play this game of like, well, what can straight versus gay Catholics do? And we talk about like straight Catholics can have awesome friends. They can be part of the community. They can go on dates. They can get married, they can choose to become a priest, they can have kids, they can all of these other things. Like, just we look at what they can do, and then we look at like gay Catholics is like you can have friends and you sure as well know the 4 different types of love and talk about how friendship's amazing, and you can pray and you can try to come out publicly to certain Catholic circles and hope you don't get burned at the stake. Like, so it's not the same standard, because when we look at what people can do about it, it's like either you're disingenuous here, and that's where, like, when Catholics talk about these, it's like if you just want to say the church teaches it, so I'm going to follow it, cool. But Catholics love making these arguments. It's known by natural reason, or we don't need religion to do it, or I can make secular arguments. It's like, okay, come with receipts. Like, instead of your sheets being like some church document, if you just say the church supports it, cool. Be intellectually honest. Say, like, I can never change my mind. Say this is never acceptable because God says so. And you're like, cool. Like, you can be honest about that, and I'm not going to argue with you until you start putting it on to other people. But if you want to say we have secular arguments, this is unnatural, this is something that we can't tolerate, and I don't need God to prove it, then actually do it. Like, be honest here.
Yeah, and I find it particularly, I'll say it again, disappointing when you find, at least I find, that a lot of the same Catholics who will very vociferously defend the idea that like gay marriage must be illegal are the same ones saying it is an error to say that, you know, church and state should be separated, and we need to install a Catholic government in the United States, whether that's a monarchy or it just means, like, you know, we flood the Supreme Court with Catholics. And I find that to be a really dangerous combination of anti-intellectualism mixed with, you know, attempting to get power, at least. And I think that's super, super dangerous. And I hope that conversations like the one that we are having right now will at least make these people consider their positions a little bit more, and maybe even if we don't change their minds on the matter, maybe they at least think about the arguments and see if, you know, they can do a better job coming up with reasons for what they believe instead of just the church said so.
Yeah, and let's dive into those questions. I'm more than happy. Everybody that's been yapping this whole time, like, let's start this conversation. Namely, like Joe over here that's talking about like, well, you're not asserting anything. Then Joe, like, we can see the stream. Like, make arguments and we'll address them. If you want to talk about, well, we can't know anything, actually put something in the comment section other than, well, you can't prove anything. Make an argument. If you think this is a secular argument you can make, put it in the comment section. More than happy for people to make arguments instead of just tearing down, or just like make an anti-gay argument, and let's address it. And we'll and Kevin, you can pick whatever comments you want to go through until somebody puts something of substance up there.
We had a good question from, hold on, where'd it go? Right here. From Shambon Yu. And he addressed it specifically to you. So he says, when you're talking about proofs, how are you using the term?
I think it's something that's on you, Mr. Shamboon here. Like, when you talk about proofs, like, present something. Like, the default position here is that we're probably going to follow science until we're proven otherwise. So it's when I say that there's no proof against being gay, it's not because I'm narrowly defining what it means to have proof. Like, put something out there, and especially if you want to put it in a scientific format, like, that's going to be much more convincing apart from semantics. So proofs can be anything that you put out there, and let's address them and work through them. But until you actually provide proofs that we can agree on, like, we're just going to keep on moving through other comments.
Yeah, and I'll add something here too, just to say, I don't think that we are using the word proof in like the mathematical sense, where we're talking about like a mathematical proof, like stuff that you would do in like upper level maths. Instead, I think that all that we mean when we're talking about proofs for tonight, evidence. I think that's really all that we're talking about. So when we're talking about proof, I think you can imagine something like, hey, imagine you came up with some study, right? Like there was some kind of study that wound up demonstrating that somehow gay love was like very detrimental to, I don't know, turns out that like, you know, the second that you love somebody of the same sex as you, like boom, half of your life is like your life expectancy is cut in half. Okay, like that would be proof in the very kind of loose way that we're using it tonight. So that would be an example. At least that's
Yeah.
how I've been kind of using it, if I've used that word tonight. So
Yeah. I think we could pull up Veritas's comment here of I'm interested in the guest's thoughts on suicide rate of homosexuals. Um, the thing here that we know from scientific studies, if you ever want to like actually look at the studies, Cornell on their website has a meta-analysis of dozens of different studies across many different things when it comes to homosexuality or transgenderism. Like, if you want to actually look at the relevant literature, go to Cornell's website. I can't remember the link off the top of my head, but I'm more than happy to send it to Kevin to put in the show notes. Um, what we know about suicide rates is that they're higher. And so the question becomes like, what do we do about it? And what does the science say happens? And all the science shows that when people are in a supportive, affirming community and live fully integrated lives, that rate drops. And I think a lot of times these like anti-gay, well, like people with same-sex attraction commit suicide at a higher rate. The question becomes like, is that because it's an intrinsic thing? It's like this dumb argument where you're like, so it's higher, and so being gay is wrong, so we should repress it and do conversion therapy, which makes it higher. Like, if we're talking about that it's a wrong or a bad thing, like, we want to lower it. What is the proven way to lower it? And it's not conversion therapy. It's having a well integrated life. Is kind of how I would talk about that subject.
And something that I can add is that I just did a whole video about how the whole trad idea of the world used to be awful, and I mean, it used to be great, and today it's awful. It's just entirely not true. And if you look at suicide per capita rates in the United States, we are at a local maximum roughly right around now. However, this local maximum is only the local maximum within the last few decades. And if you actually take a look at all of the decades for which we have reliable data, we are still about a third lower in terms of the peak suicide rates than we were at the last peak. The last peak occurring in the 1940s, I think, which is understandable, right? Like World War II. Well, I don't want to call it understandable, but I think World War II was causing a lot of despair. And so we saw a huge peak in like the 1940s. And yeah, and we're at a local peak right now, but we're still about 33% lower today than we were in the 1940s. So we're not it's just not the case that there is some kind of like never before seen wave of suicide that's occurring.
And we could look at like lost but founds. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Which one?
Yeah. Lost but found's comment here. Should we affirm things if it leads to better consequences? The answer is like, if it doesn't harm other people and there's an evidence-based approach to things, the answer is yes. Catholics love this as like a gotcha. And you're like, should we affirm things that lead to better consequences? And the answer is like, yes, because when we look at homosexuality, there's no negative effects to the rest of society. It's not victimizing anybody. And what we're seeing here is that we do have better consequences by affirming this and giving people a pathway to a normal life. Like I said, go to Cornell's basically list of all of the studies out there. So it's like, and because the follow-up in what the argument is after this is like, well, should we affirm insert some sort of crime or some sort of thing that victimizes people? And you're like, no, because we can empirically verify the fact that this does harm. When we talk about, and we don't want to get demonetized on YouTube, other things that Catholics like to lump in with homosexuality involving older and younger people, the answer is like, we can see that the consequences are terrible for people involved in it. So when we talk about, yeah, we should affirm things that lead to better consequences for people in general.
No, yeah. Excellent points. Can I go to one of Colin's comments? So Colin wrote, he says, and so this was, I was talking about kind of like empiricism and like looking for some kind of study, and Colin says that wouldn't work for the types who, I'll call them the scholastic types, because morality for them is 100% detached from results. They care only about divine commands. And that reminds me that I didn't get on my soapbox about how natural law theory is just divine command theory in fancy robes. So maybe for 2 seconds, you guys will humor me and I'll kind of talk about this. So when you read Phaser's works, I'm thinking of works like Aquinas, A Beginner's Guide, his book on New Atheism, Scholastic Metaphysics, If you read his works like that, he will talk about how goodness is adhering to a form, but then, you might be able, like, in one breath, Phaser will talk about how, like, the form of the marital act is partially procreation. So any marital act that cannot procreate is therefore, like, imperfect, and that's why it's a sin. But then out of the other side of his mouth, Phaser will say something like, "Well, actually, that's not what it's all about." And why does he say that's not what it's all about? Because of walking on your hands, right? Because of diet soda. My go-to example is oat fiber. I put a scoop of oat fiber into my morning shake every day. Oat fiber is 100% indigestible. It is 0 calories, just fiber. That's all it is. I put it into my shakes every day. I imagine that I'm frustrating the ends of my intestines or whatever, but nobody talks about that. And Phaser would say nobody talks about that because the final end of the human being is to make it to heaven, is union with God. So at the end of the day, what's actually important is that we do whatever it takes to fulfill our final purpose as a human person, which is to get to heaven. And what does that sound like? Divine command theory. Just do whatever God says you're supposed to do so that you go to heaven. So I think that teleology, I think that all of natural law ethics is just divine command theory in fancy robes. That's my hot take of the day.
And that's where it's all this anti-intellectual exercise, because at the end of the day, it's just like, are you going to be tortured for all of eternity or be in heaven? And so when we talk about, like, when Catholics love bringing up, like, if we talk about studies that relate to homosexuality that might prove their point, it's like, even if we disprove them, you're still going to hold to the position. And then any other thing that you throw out there, if those get taken down, you're still just going to divert to, well, heaven, insert God's command. And that's why, like, you're not actually going off of the evidence. You've already arrived at conclusions, and you're backfilling and reverse engineering how to make arguments as cover stories. And as we take the layers away, it's like Scooby-Doo when you take like 8 layers of masks out, and then it's just like, because God told me so at the end of the day. As like, that's why it's this dishonest exercise in trying to reason with people. I was reading through comments, see if there's any that you want to bring up.
Veritas just said something. You're saying that there is no scientific research on the impact of sexuality on a child that is sexually abused. Pretty sure that there is. That might not be aimed at us. I don't know.
Like, really overwhelming evidence.
Yeah, it's there's definitely evidence that people who were abused as children, like, suffer like anxiety and depression and PTSD at, like, far higher rates than people who were not abused as children. Yeah, I don't know if that I might have been, like, interrupting that might not be directed at us as much as it was directed at somebody else. Just figured that was kind of, I didn't think that would be a contentious point.
I'm just looking at, Veritas's comments, and it's like, I don't know exactly what they're referring to, other than they're clearly trying to make some anti-gay argument. Same thing here of Collins saying the LGBT identification preceded the abuse on average, which I'm going to guess the claim there is that, like, people in the queer community abuse at higher rates, which we don't have any study that supports that. There are studies that are done incredibly poorly that basically lump attractions to members of the same sex as minor people of the same sex, which are two categorical distinctions. So none of the studies actually say that on average, the average adult person who's attracted to members of the same sex have any higher rates of abuse. I'm just trying to read through these comments here.
Yeah, this is the most difficult part about streaming, is actually paying attention to the comments. It's, like, the hardest part.
Yeah.
So Veritas, here's what I will say. My question was, can it lead them to a homosexual lifestyle? The evidence does not support that claim. The evidence is that gay children are abused at higher rates than non-gay children. That is what the evidence points to. I don't think that there's any solid evidence that suggests that being gay is a result of abuse. I don't think that there's any compelling evidence for that. And I don't believe that's been part of like the literature for like 2 decades at this point. I'm sure that like in the 90s and stuff like that, I'm sure that people were still taking this theory seriously. But there's been like a lot of research done in like the past like couple of decades, and I do not believe that this is taken seriously, like in the literature anymore. And I'm happy to be corrected on that. But
because then, and yeah, because even if we say that, like, even if we take that point where abuse is what causes people to be attracted to members of the same sex, which isn't scientifically supported, but if for the sake of the argument we presuppose that to be true, the answer is it's still not harming anybody, and there's no proof to get that to go away, meaning that all of our proof when it comes, or all of the science when it comes to conversion therapy and restorative therapy, however you want to label it, is that it doesn't work and it leads to people having much worse outcomes. So even if, and I'm not saying it's true, which it's not true, even if it were true, it still wouldn't even prove your point, because then the question becomes, so what do we do about it? And I think that's something that people miss when it comes to studies, is like, as the joke is like everything's going to cause cancer in our natural environments. Tables cause cancer. This new chemical causes cancer. Radio waves cause cancer. There's a study that shows harming anything out there. So the question becomes like, so what are we going to do about it? Because one study came out about 5G is the solution, like burn down all cell towers and live in the Stone Ages. It's like we got to have a proportionate response. And I'd seen earlier in the stream somewhere that like somebody was talking about that rates of disease in gay communities are higher, which was true 30, 40, 50 years ago. Now that isn't true. But even if it were true, it still wouldn't prove that pursuing a lifestyle that leads to higher rates of suicide is the solution there. So we talk about like, well, not only what is the conclusion of the study, but like, what are we going to do about it? We have to make measured responses. So some other comment up here was saying that that among gay marriages that the rate of monogamy is lower, so marriages are more or less they're plain marriage. And once again, the answer is like, even if you are true, which is like I would have no doubt that rates of ethical non-monogamy or polyamory, or like whatever term we want to call it, are higher in the gay community. The answer is like, so what? Like, people get married, but marriage is a legal institution. They use the benefits of marriage from a societal and from a legal perspective. And it's something that they want. We're not mandating, we don't have mandatory gay marriage here that people don't want it. It's for people that do want it, they can have it, even if you don't agree with their decisions to begin with.
If you don't mind, I'm going to pull up, I think, 2 comments. The first one is from No One Someone, and I don't remember if... So anyway, let me just read this. And sexuality is a modern conception. Trying to read current views onto the past is a problem. One has to read relevant philosophy in that light as well. So I'm not studied at all in like gender theory or anything like that. However, the more that I read about, like, for instance, like ancient Roman culture, the more that I seem to think that like their concept of sexuality just wasn't like ours. Like it kind of just seems like everybody was bi, kind of like, no, that's a gross oversimplification. But it just seems like they really didn't have the same social hangups that people in, 1993 USA had. Right. And so I think that is fair. Sexuality is a modern conception. Maybe the modern conception of morality is not the same of sexuality is not the same as the concept of morality of sexuality that was present in the 1st century ancient Near East, right? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on what does somebody mean by sexuality as a modern concept. I think a lot of the language that we use is modern. Like the term gay hasn't always meant homosexual, and the language surrounding like people are born, or not even born, but people have innate non-transient attractions to member of the same sex is like, that's like, yeah, if you're a feudal person working in every single second of every single day, like, of course you're not going to use the same terminology or use and talk about it in the same way. And when we talk about marriage as an institution circa a few hundred years ago, it was about land, it was about inheritance, and we talk about a lot of arranged marriages are so foreign to our concept now that in a way we can say like the idea of like you can choose who you marry and what you want to do about life, and you have the time and the place on Maslow's hierarchy of needs to actually like explore these questions is a big thing. But we know that homosexual activity, so adult male on male activity, has happened for all of eternity, happens in many different species, that this is something that's been around for a long time. The language might have evolved, but it's been there for forever. So it really comes down to like, what does somebody mean by sexuality as a modern concept, to give it like a yes or no answer.
Yeah, and the thing that like really sticks out to me is like I've been trying to read up on a lot of like kind of like I guess like textual criticism and stuff like that of like the New Testament and all that. And something that like appears to be the case is like prior to, at least in the first century ancient Near East and before, it really seems like the way that they thought about sex was that it was something that one person did to another person. It wasn't something that two people participated in together. And that seems to be like just like a huge difference between the first century and the 21st century. Like it just seems like like we no longer think about sex as something that one person does to somebody else. And like if you do think about it that way, then like
Yeah.
geez, your poor partner, you know what I mean? That sounds like they're not having a good time at all. But today we
Yeah.
think a lot more about sex being something that people do together, not something that one person does to somebody else. And I just think that's worth
Yeah,
pointing
I
out.
mean those Greeks were wild, and that's where like all of this like pearl clutching surround homosexuality is like the ancient Greeks would go off to war, and it was just like a thing people talked about, and they came home, and then they had their wives cut their hair short so that they more closely resembled their sexual partners during wartime, and that it was a pretty common practice for men to have more or less their side hoes, for lack of a better term, that were men, and it wasn't seen as this like, are you gay or you're straight? It was just like people do things. And we talk about, and this is like all a lot of ancient history is all like isn't a super hard science. When we talk about like Alexander the Great or maybe some other big ruler had the equivalent of a $2 billion funeral after his close male friend who he hooked up with died. It's like I don't know if we can call that like they just hooked up to spend $2 billion on a funeral and be like in terrible grief for the rest of your life. Like, I don't know, bro. That's kind of gay when you think about it. Like, I don't know what other option we have other than it's happened for forever, and it's people that have a 1960s mentality on sex that do this pearl clutching routine. Everybody else, through most of history, it's a pretty like normal thing. Um, Juan has a question is being gay a biological fact or a social construct? Once again, it comes down to like, what do we mean by being gay? When we talk about like biological fact, it's like, do we mean that people have sexual attractions that don't change to members of the opposite sex? And the answer is like, yes, this is an immutable thing that seems to present very early on in childhood. There's really no evidence that it's like a sudden onset type of thing. We might not say from birth. A lot of it's going to come down to epigenetics, is really what the science points to. So whatever the origin is, it's not something that changes. Apart from maybe some stories of people who paid a ton of money to a reparative therapist, are like the only people that can actually talk about it, and they always get busted like 10 years later for actually sleeping around. So biological fact, we mean a permanent disposition. Yes, social construct. It's like gay culture is a social construct, in the same thing that Catholic culture is a construct, in the same thing that everything in culture is a construct. So the answer to Juan's question is like yes, and depending on what exactly you mean.
I don't think I have anything to add there. I think that was really good. Um, Shambonu says, I think this is aimed at me because he tagged me in the next one. He says, divine command theory seeks to derive good and evil extrinsically, while natural law seeks to derive good and evil intrinsically. So here's what I have to say to that. To some degree, people like Phaser will agree with you because they'll talk about how the goodness of a triangle actually comes from the fact that the lines are perfectly straight and the angles add up to exactly 180 degrees. So that would be a intrinsic way of deriving the goodness. However, they don't mean the same thing. They don't mean moral goodness when they talk about goodness. There's nothing immoral about a poorly drawn triangle where the sides are not very straight. And so when natural law theorists are talking about what is actually morally good and morally wrong, the only thing that they are concerned with is the natural end of the human person, which is to spend eternity in heaven with God. And so that's why I think that it does collapse into the same thing. Because as much as the natural law theorists like to talk about the goodness and badness of a triangle or a chair or a table, they are not talking about a moral goodness or badness. They're just talking about conformity with a idealized version of that thing. So when the goodness has two different definitions, we'll call it like goodness A means conformity to the essence, but goodness B means whatever it takes to get you to heaven. So that's why I think they still collapse into the same thing. And sorry, that's my little like soapboxy thing. I saw more questions for us. Man, I can't keep up with the chat. There's
one from Colin a while ago that says,
go ahead.
We can go with the one on screen here. Okay. Do you believe you need scientific evidence in order to believe in God? I hate to do like the Jordan Peterson routine. And it's like, well, what do you mean by believe? And what do you mean by God? Like, these aren't even clear terms to begin with. And then like, what do we mean by need? It's like, we get so quickly into this land of like talking about terms in general that I think in general, I'm going to want my beliefs or to the degree of which I believe in something to have evidence that mounts up to it. I think nearly every decision that I make, or at least decisions that I think we make legislative decisions off of, or large social decisions, is either it comes down to there's got to be some science involved. So until we have a way of demonstrating the existence of God or interacting with the existence of God, like the only other option is this game of special pleading of, well, God's outside of science, so we don't use science. So it's like, so what are we going to do to investigate God other than make claims and throw words on a piece of paper and make a word salad and then reconstruct it into like Jesus? Like, I don't know. That's a whole other like topic for a stream. So that's as much as I'll talk about that.
And I'll address this briefly by saying, like, unapologetically, like, yes, I think that I would need, and maybe I should couch that in something like this. Don't get me wrong, I'm cool with the syllogism. If A, B, or if we wanted to say like, if A, God exists, A, therefore God exists, great, cool, I'm in. Even though, is that a scientific way of proving that God exists? Well, maybe you want to argue that it's logical, not scientific. Fine. But guess what? How do we prove A? Empiricism. So, it's going to wind up coming down to empiricism.
Yeah.
Even if you're not proving God explicitly through empiricism, you're going to wind up proving the premises that you're using in your syllogism through empiricism. So I do think that it boils down to empiricism. Why? Because that's the only game in town, right? I just don't think that there is any other way for us to actually come to any kind of justified true belief in anything. That's just my 2 cents.
And then we talk about like people that love talking about like the Kalam argument or beginning of the universe arguments. And you really think that like William Lane Craig has a better conception of what happened at the Big Bang than somebody that's written scientific papers on this for like all of eternity? Like, people that investigate the big game don't write out philosophical Aristotelian syllogisms. They do science. And so I find that when like some 18-year-olds read one book on philosophy and talks about syllogisms and then the nature of God, and you're like, you know better than people who've studied their entire life and spent billions of dollars on particle physics and exploration, the beginning of the universe. Like, you really think your syllogism's that much more sound than science. And rant.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just even go as far as to say, like, every syllogism that isn't just a tautology is going to wind up relying on the truthfulness of the premises. And as long as it's not tautological, then the truthfulness of the premises will be determined by science, by empiricism. Like, it's the only game in town, as far as I can tell. I don't know of any other ways to reliably come up with true beliefs. And if we did have other ways, that'd be awesome. Like, if we had some kind of source of divine revelation that proved itself to be reliable over time, I would then start to trust that method of divine revelation. Like, I'm not like married to empiricism. I'm not like, I don't worship at the altar of empiricism. It's just the only thing that has been proven to work over and over and over. And so if we find something else that winds up working over and over and over, fantastic. I'll use that. But until we find that thing, I'm stuck with empiricism.
Yeah, I agree there. Where we play this game and that's where like some of these arguments, like we got to touch grass on these things, people. Like we got to ground instead of talking about these things out there. It's like I think people just want to live good lives. And so when we talk about like, would we rather put all of our collective brain power to like spending all of eternity talking about philosophy and what does it mean to pursue a good life? Or it's like, would we rather spread Christianity to an underdeveloped nation, or would we rather like build a stable political government and like end famine? It's like we could either put all of our knowledge and our brain power towards science and improve people's lives, and like sure we can talk about like unfulfillment in the West, and we can talk about like, well, you do need meaning, you need some sort of direction, but like, or would we rather play the game of like, let's talk all the day about the existence of God and not get to any consensus? When we talk about the number of people that agree on God is like virtually nobody when it comes to planet Earth. Or it's like, or when we talk about science, regardless of what country you're from or what time frame you're in, you can run the same studies and come to the same conclusions and not write endless apologetic books using all of the trees on planet Earth to print arguments off of the Catholic Answers Press that doesn't do anything to improve people's lives. Or we could put that money towards ending famine or doing literally anything helpful for people's lives. Yeah.
No, I'm totally with you. I do a lot of reading of philosophy stuff, and every now and then I like snap out of it, and I'm like, I studied engineering in school. Like, what am I doing with this philosophy stuff? You know what I mean? Like, sometimes I'm like, just show me, in God we trust, all else must bring data. That is a phrase that we used in engineering school, and we were being ironic when we said it, but we meant, look, we don't believe you unless you bring data. And that is how we put men on the moon, right? That mindset is how we put men on the moon. That mindset is how we invented cell phones and the internet that we're using to have this conversation right now. And so I take that as seriously as the results are, and I take things like natural law as seriously as the results are as well. That is to say, I take the scientific method very seriously, and I take natural law not seriously at all.
Yeah, and that's where like there's some comments here on empiricism and like, well, we can't prove God without empiricism, or if you only subscribe to empiricism. And you're like, that's exactly the point. Like, correct. Like if we talk about God, of like believing in God, you mean like you have a supernatural belief or a faith, or like you have a framework that makes you feel more comfy out there in the world. Like you're not gonna have atheists knocking on people's doors, like giving them like the write-up or like sending them to the Inquisition. Like, do you only hold to empiricism? It's like, no. So like if you hold beliefs about the world, awesome. The question becomes like, when you want other people to believe those things, or you use that to legislate things. Like we didn't syllogism our way through civil rights. We didn't syllogism our way out of poverty. We didn't syllogism our way to the moon. We didn't syllogism our way to ending polio. Like syllogisms are like a cool, fancy thing to do when you're bored. Well, you're sitting in the convenience of your modern office. It's the same thing that like conservative Catholics love making these arguments. Like all of these socialist teenagers hate capitalism while they're on their iPhones and drinking Starbucks. It's like we can throw the reverse argument around of like you're talking about meaning and truth and these syllogisms as you're in a house that was built off of science, in a comfortable environment that provides you the ability to actually have a decent life and have free time and not be killed by woolly mammoths and starving in the Middle Ages. Like that's all of your brain power that you spend arguing on the internet because you don't have a life is all because of science, not because of syllogisms.
Preach. But also I want to even just kind of disagree with someone on this. So assuming that you are somebody who believes in the God of the Old Testament, and even the God of the New Testament, right? Because he became like embodied, I guess, right? This is a God that interacts with the physical world. And if this is a God that interacts with the physical world, then it definitely is knowable through empiricism. As long as this kind of God isn't totally causally inert, then it should be detectable through empiricism. We haven't detected it yet, but that certainly doesn't mean that it's impossible. There are countless things that exists that we haven't found through empiricism yet. So even if I was a religious, like if I was a theist, I would still probably be an empiricist because I don't know. I just can't imagine myself not being an empiricist, I guess. But and I would just say like, yeah, no, I fully expect that one day we will be able to empirically verify the existence of God, because I think that God interacts with the physical world. And as long as he does interact with the physical world, then you can verify that the God exists through empiricism. So I kind of just disagree with the premise.
Going to Lost and Found's earlier question of does consciousness exist? If it seems to, where is it located and was it made of? And the second comment of like, what about numbers? It's like, that's what I talk about. Like, we're not touching grass when you're like, well, what are numbers? And you're like, they're numbers. Like, we use them and we do awesome things with them. And like, good luck trying to talk to like your abuelita about like, do numbers exist? Like, it's just such a dumb argument that the only way to engage in these arguments is to like get so far away from grass, which is like, we do math. Like, sure, we don't have a massive textbook about like numbers are like whatever. It's like, but they work is like how we approach numbers. Same thing with like, does consciousness exist? It's like, is Thomas Aquinas going to figure out where consciousness exists, or is medical psychiatry advancing that field rapidly and actually being able to approve and agree upon things? So it's like, either we can just say like consciousness exists because God told me to, and God of the gaps argument, or it's like, or you could spend your mental brain power actually looking at science and the field's advancing. Like I said, we're not going to syllogism our way out of like mental health issues or talking about consciousness or brain studies. Like, you don't syllogism your way into a scientific study. It's like, do science instead of arguing about like what are numbers on the internet. Is like, what are we talking about here apart from like floating away from grass in real life?
Yeah, no, agreed. What do you say we take like one or two more? But I'm not counting this one in the one or two. No one, someone just wanted to say he's not Christian. So sorry for saying if you are Christian, then you probably believe you're not Christian. Sorry about that. Didn't mean to. But what if you pick one and I pick one?
Yeah, I just want to tell Lost and Found in the chat here. Like, I will respond to evidence from now on, but I will not respond to claims only. Make a scientific claim. Like, all that you're doing, Lost and Found, is asserting these philosophical things. And the whole point of this entire exercise is like, if you can claim from natural reason, or not even natural reason, from science, that homosexuality is wrong, like, do it instead of like, I only respond to evidence. Like, you're playing this whack-a-mole game. Like, assert a scientific thing out there that isn't just a hypothesis, and we'll engage with it instead of like, well, you got to prove whatever. It's like, can anybody throw a scientific study? Anybody on the chat who disagrees, I get that we might not get to the end of like, let's talk about philosophy, but if anybody wants to throw a scientific fact out there, that would be awesome. Throw a scientific fact out there and we'll stop calling your position anti-scientific or not even related to science.
Cool. And if you want to pick one more after this one, feel free. If you also want to be done, feel free. I've got my final one picked out right here. And so Lost But Found said, verified by what? Logical necessity it has, but not by empiricism, perhaps. Don't know exactly what that means, but then he says, if empiricism is all that you accept, you're just begging the question. So here is why you can be an empiricist without begging the question. An empiricist is not saying that they can verify empiricism is the only method that works through empiricism, because that would be circular. But what you are saying is, I'd be happy to accept any other method that is reliable and proves itself to be a worthwhile endeavor. And that's how I am. I would be thrilled if we found some other method of reliably coming up with true beliefs. Imagine that we found something else besides empiricism that had the same predictive power that empiricism does. Imagine that we found like some kind of like arcane magic that let us put people on the moon and communicate with people who are, 600 or 700 miles away, or however far the two of us are from each other right now. Like, imagine we found some kind of like arcane magic that could do that. I mean, we're talking about stuff out of like science fiction and fantasy books right now. But if we did, I wouldn't question the results. I would be thrilled with that. And I would stop calling myself an empiricist maybe, because I'd be like, well, I'm an empiricist and I'm a arcanist or whatever, like because of this arcane magic system. So at the end of the day, what I am is I'm a pragmatist. I use what works. And the only thing that I can tell actually works consistently is empiricism. If you have something else, I'm all ears, and I'm super excited to hear all about this other method that you have for arriving at true beliefs. I'd love to hear all about it. And that's the last one that I'll take for today. Kate, did you have one more that you wanted to do, maybe?
This person that I'm in the comments with who says they left a scientific claim earlier. I don't see that here. There's a ton of comments, and I just said there of, can you post it again, which I don't feel like is an intellectually honest exercise here. Let me think. I'm just reading through here. Yeah.
No
Okay,
rush.
that makes more sense there.
I'm not a professional YouTuber anyway. So.
I think, yeah. And unless somebody wants to throw any scientific study out there, I think kind of like the final note here is that, how to say this? There are people out there, and even when I was in the church, that homosexuality or leaving the church is built up as this huge thing. Your life's going to be terrible. You're going to have no meaning. Where like a lot of these times, these aren't emotional arguments. People are scared of leaving. They're scared of embracing their identity. They're full of self-hatred. Whatever it is, there's all these emotional cases out there. And why I didn't want to leave, because I was like, oh, the homosexual lifestyle is unfulfilling, or my life won't be as good, or Christ provides me true peace, provides me true understanding. Whatever it is, we make all of these emotional claims out there about how Christianity is good, and people testimony their way into religion. And I think if the reason why you're Catholic, or the reason why you promote Catholicism, is because of a testimony, and largely that's a convincing piece, I think it's only fair to also have testimonies in the opposite direction, which in my case is that I thought that in Catholicism was the happiest that I could be, that I was truly fulfilled, that I was truly at peace. And then I left and built a life, fell in love, and I love my life more now. I'm more at peace. And this is an awesome way to live. And everything that I thought I was going to lose in religion, I found outside of religion and in a better way. And my life is so much better. So we can claim the devil is deceiving people, which is like, once again, we have an anti-intellectual, unfalsifiable claim out there. Because I can say the reason why you're happy in Catholicism is because the devil's deceiving you. Like, we can throw that around. What we have to understand is that if you talk to anybody who lives the homosexual lifestyle, if we want to call it that, somebody who doesn't hate themselves, somebody who's built an awesome marriage, whatever it is, they are happier than, in my experience, the average traditional Catholic out there. That there is a better way of doing life other than reading apologists and reading ancient books and playing this game of like, is this going to send me to hell? There is a better way to live. You can be happy outside the church. You can live a better life, and you don't have to spend all of your time trying to figure out what's going to send you to hell or not. There's so much, there's a way better way to live out there. And that's why I say a lot of things come back to just, let's touch grass. Let's talk to people instead of condemning people and arguing with people and talking their philosophical points aren't valid. Like, talk to people and they love their lives and they hate the life that you're proposing. You can call it whatever it is, but when we look at the science, when we look at everybody who we talk to, the only people who say the church is the only true way to be happy are people who are in the church, and people outside of the church who've left the church live happier lives near universally. There's a better way to live out there and make pragmatic decisions that are best for your life. Don't go out there harming people. Let's make some rational decisions here that aren't based off of ancient texts and live awesome, fulfilling lives.
I don't know if my microphone is actually picking it up, but I am snapping for you. Cade, that was, I think, the perfect way for us to end. My forever last question, though, is where can we find you, the name of your channel, and also just tell me what's one thing that you're working on that you're really excited about.
Yeah, so I'm linked down below in the description, but you can just go to my channel, Gay X Trad Speaks. Right now I have 2 videos out, one on the Father Jackson case that I recorded in my car, a quick little video there. Also put out a reaction video to Father Mike Schmitz. For everybody that is yapping to high heaven in the comment section, go subscribe to my channel. You'll get 2 hours of a further in-depth discussion of this. And I more than welcome video replies. As we were talking about earlier, people that I have no doubt, you know who you are going to leave huge comments down below. Like, make a video, show your face, like, have an argument. I'm not going to argue within the comment sections. put a video out there. I would love to engage with you guys. I have a few fun projects that I'm working on, a few different reaction videos. One is on Trent Horn losing his mind about a frog and toad being gay and makes an argument about how gays ruin friendships. Which like Trent Horn is generally like a pretty like smart, sharp guy, and I understand his points. And I've listened to some of his videos, but I've listened to this video like 5 or 6 times now, and it's actually incoherent and rambling. So that'll be a fun one to go after. For all of you yappers in the comment section, like send me an email. My email's on my channel. Send me videos to react to. I'm more than happy to engage in videos. Subscribe to the channel. What other fun things? Yeah, and you guys are gonna want to follow the channel for a great documentary that's coming out that you're not gonna want to miss. I'll say that.
I am going to be refreshing your channel when I suspect that it's coming out soon. That's how excited I am for it. Cade, this was awesome. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I look forward to watching the growth of your channel. I say that with both admiration and with envy at how much better you are at this than I am. But I say that with sincerity. I am like beyond thrilled when more people join this kind of weird little niche that we're in online, because I don't want to be the only person doing this stuff. And you are exactly the kind of person that we need doing this stuff. So I'm grateful and also terrified and envious that you are doing this. But this was awesome.
It should be fun because the note overall, there's a ton of atheist channels out there, and everybody's like ex-evangelical or ex-Mormon out there. There's really no big mainstream channels out there from a Catholic background when so much of religion out there is based on Catholicism. So the hope, and you'll see from my style of videos, that it's not, I'll have some deep dives in philosophy, but it'll be a lot of that reacting to big videos. It'll be accessible to non-Catholics and rooted in touching grass and people wanting to live lives that they want to live versus trying to spend their entire life trying to figure out what book is right.
Awesome. Cade, thank you so much for coming on. Everybody go find Gay Extrad Speaks in the description down below, and we will see you next time.